Let's take a look now at the Sunday papers. I'm joined this morning by political journalist Zoe Grunwald and Sacha O'Sullivan, host of Westminster Insider at Politico Europe. Welcome to both of you. And a very good morning. And a lot of politics around in the papers this morning. We're kicking off with The Observer, aren't we? At their front page, rather clever kind of, I can't remember what you call those things, where you mash up someone's face from lots of different people's profiles and basically talking about Labour tearing itself apart, Sacha.
Yes, so this is kind of referring to the long essay which Tony Blair wrote earlier this week, which basically said that another Labour leadership contest would make the party look unserious. And I think the most interesting thing out of that essay was him saying that a lot of politicians and Labour politicians have spent too much time looking at themselves, have spent too much time looking at the raw politics of things and not focusing on the actual policy meat. And that's what's led Labour into the kind of chaos that they are, where you have these shadow leadership contests being run without a formal leadership contest actually being called, which is a pretty strange set of circumstances for us to end up in.
Yeah, indeed. And you know, the fact that he's, again, reiterating his points and feels he wants to come back, having seen the criticism that he's got for his words, is quite interesting, that he still wants to be heard.
Yeah, you can't stop Tony Blair talking about what he thinks the Labour Party should do. He particularly is responding to this criticism that he's received that he's been a big proponent of AI, and obviously his work at the Tony Blair Institute and has been a big proponent of AI as well, and he's had to kind of fight off some criticism that maybe there's a little bit of self-interest in there. And he's saying, no, it's not that there's self-interest, it's actually that I am seeing every day the influence of AI and seeing what it can do, and I think it would be foolish if we don't harness its capabilities. But of course, a lot of people are deeply concerned about what AI is going to do to the workforce. You know, we have had back-to-back headlines this week essentially about the unemployment crisis, especially amongst young people. You know, there are lots of concerns that if we harness AI, is this just going to make the rich business owners or, you know, the people profiting from it richer? And what is it going to do to those people who have certain jobs that could be taken by this technology? So a lot of criticism on Blair there. He's also talking about, he's sort of fighting back against Andy Burnham's argument that economic conditions are fueling populism. He says, actually, we need to look at the cultural circumstances that have led to the rise of populism as well, but not a huge amount of explaining there. There's essentially a lot of things in there that I think some people would say, well, Tony Blair, when you were Prime Minister, you might have actually had some hand in creating these conditions, but also saying, is it necessarily useful to have him kind of wading into the issues that Labour are facing?
And that's what's quite interesting here. I mean, the headline is Labour rips itself apart, but in some ways, as Tony Blair united some competing forces within the party to come together and say, no, Tony Blair, you're wrong, and we're right, and this is what we're all about.
Absolutely, and one of the lines in the essay is he talks about the Labour Party's infinite capacity for self-introspection. This, to me, just looks like way more self-introspection, where it's you know, he's kind of writing this long essay, and then someone comes back and Andy Burnham says this and Wes Streeting says this, and this looks like the party talking to itself rather than talking to the people and the issues that are really of concern to voters, things like the cost of living, things like the youth unemployment rate, but instead it's long essays on Substack.
Yeah, and what do you think the ultimate impact will be of it, just before we move on, Zoe? I mean, do you think that, I mean, how many Labour MPs are real supporters of Tony Blair and will hang on his every word? And what might the reaction be?
Well, I think there are a lot of Labour MPs who respect that Tony Blair was a successful, in many ways, Prime Minister. You know, he managed to win elections and, you know, there was some support of the party. But there's others who really remember the legacy of Iraq, who see some of the issues that are present in the UK now and bring them back to Blair. You know, they're looking at kind of the influence of the private sector there and, you know, that kind of, globalist view. And, of course, the spectre of Peter Mandelson. I mean, there's a lot of things that I think some Labour MPs think that actually roads lead back to Tony on. So I think the view is mixed, but I think definitely when it comes, as Sacha was saying, when it comes to kind of looking at what's going on in the Labour Party at the minute and trying to move on from it, looking back and constantly hearing from Tony Blair, I think a lot of people would say it's not particularly useful. We need to look forward and think about where the party's going rather than kind of rehashing Blair's legacy.
OK, let's move on to the front of the Telegraph next, the Sunday Telegraph. Their headline, benefit checks watered down. And this is a sense of a system under huge pressure and some steps being proposed to speed things up.
Yeah, so this comes out of an initial desire to reduce the number of kind of bureaucratic checks on the welfare system. And it concerns personal independence payments, which means that people over the age of 25 who are on PIP end up having given the benefit for 4 years initially and then get checks every 6 years after that. Previously, according to this piece, it was checks as much every once a year. Now, the government said this was to make it easier for the Department for Work and Pensions to deal with it, for the welfare system to actually look at where they can get people back into work rather than constantly checking the benefits in place. This story is suggesting, in fact, that's not quite right, and it was basically only introduced in order to stop the system from collapsing in on itself because there's so many more people claiming benefit and there's not enough staff to actually deal with the claims coming through.
Yeah, the number of claimants, I think, is at a record high now and obviously costing a lot of money as well. So what do you make of what's going on here, Zoe?
Well, I think, obviously, this has been a real problem for Labour, not least because it was one of their biggest backbench rebellions hinged on changing the PIP welfare rules, but also because this seems to be something that the opposition really feel they can latch onto. You know, when you talk about anything like defence spending or any other issues, you know, councils and the public service, it has now just become a really easy backbench refrain, or I should say opposition refrain, to say, just cut the welfare bill. But, of course, if you just cut the welfare bill, you have to think about all the people who were previously receiving benefits, who need that kind of support from the state, who are suddenly going to go without. And there is this kind of conflation that when we talk about benefits, we're talking about people who just don't want to work. Actually, a lot of people who are on PIP, which is the particular benefit that's under discussion, use PIP in order to be able to go to work. And of course, there are other issues. If you listen to disability campaigners, they will tell you a lot of disabled people or people who are out of work want to work, but workplaces simply aren't simply aren't adhering to some of the things that they could do to make it easier for those people to work. So I think we're hearing a lot about benefits because it's very easy for those in opposition without actually the power to say, if we just cut this, that's the golden ticket. But it's much more complex in practice.
Yeah, and Alan Milburn, very keen to say, when talking about young people's unemployment, that this anxiety that many of them are feeling is genuine, that it's absolutely wrong to call people snowflakes. They do need support and help. But we are getting a sense from the government, aren't we, that there's, Pat McFadden has talked about, more money for apprenticeships, for example, to sort of try and help companies afford to take more people on. Is that the way you see the government going in future, to try and keep the welfare bill down, but also help young people?
I think absolutely that's the end goal. Getting there is a very difficult road. I thought the Milburn review was very, very good at kind of elucidating some of those concerns that the young people who aren't in work are just lazy or they don't want to work. That's not the case. They just don't have the opportunities. They don't have things like Saturday jobs, for example. There was one stat in the Milburn report which I thought was really interesting, which is that for every £25 spent on benefits in the welfare system, only £1 is spent by DWP on getting people back into work. And looking at that in the context of this story, maybe it was the case that these new reviews were brought in to ease the pressure, but if that enables parts of the welfare system to say we're going to look at getting people back into work rather than constantly reviewing the benefits that are already in place, I think that's a much better path to be on.
Really interesting to see how much of a shift we get. And Pat McFadden is actually going to be on Trevor Phillips' show at 8:30 this morning, so interesting to see what he says. Quickly on to the Sunday Times, Zoe. Streeting and Hunt intervene on growth crisis.
Yes, so Wes Streeting has given an interview to the Sunday Times where he's essentially said that the government should cut employer national insurance in order to encourage businesses to hire young people. So, as we've just been talking about, there is a real crisis of unemployment amongst young people. And there's a number of reasons for this, but one of the reasons that has been cited as a much more kind of recent reason is the government's decision to put up employer national insurance contributions, which were increased by 1.2 percentage points last year to 15%. That was in the 2024 budget. This basically means that businesses are kind of less willing to take on sort of younger, lower paid workers because kind of the cost of training them and everything else that goes into it just doesn't seem worth it when there's more costs on business. Obviously, this is part of Wes Streeting's kind of pitch for leadership. So he's also talked about a wealth tax. He's also talked about returning to the European Union. But here he seems to be pitching particularly at young people and saying, actually, what can we do to ease the burden on young people and encourage businesses to take a chance on them? I think this is really interesting in the context of, obviously, the benefits checks being watered down and our conversation about NEETs. Clearly, this issue about young people and their futures is becoming more and more prevalent, and I think that is way overdue. You know, we have a political and democratic system where young people's interests aren't really represented because, you know, in a parliamentary democracy, you don't get people under the age of 21, essentially. So I think it's really good that we're hearing these perspectives more and more, but I think a lot of people will be worried that, is this just a kind of leadership pitch and will it actually...
A leadership or a pitch to be Chancellor, or
yeah.
a lot of these...
Or to be Chancellor, indeed.
Linked to that job as well. What do you make of what you say?
Well, I think it's really interesting politically as well, because, you know, clearly Wes Streeting is angling to be Prime Minister. Whether he gets there or not, we will find out. But there is a concern in the Labour Party that they're losing that young vote, that a lot of that young vote is looking to parties like the Greens and thinking, oh, you actually represent me more. And I think this is a kind of subtle admission of how difficult that will be, holding that coalition of voters together. So he's trying to do things like this to look at young people and then also, you know, slightly more radical ideas such as rejoining the European Union, radical depending on who you ask, of course. But you can see him trying to stitch together a very, very broad coalition of voters, which he would need if he were to become Prime Minister and then end up in a general election.
Yeah, trying to pitch to backbench Labour MPs and the country at the same time. Yeah, really interesting to see how these prospective candidates, when there's no leadership contest formally going on, pitch their lines. We're out of time for this hour, but lots more stories to get our teeth into in the next hour, so thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
We're trying to see as much as we can.